You know that feeling. You're alone in your room. The door is closed. No sound, no movement, nothing out of place. And yet somewhere, deep in your chests, something tightens. Your body goes still, like it's listening to a frequency your ears can't quite catch. Because somehow, you don't feel alone. It's not a thought. It's not even fear at first. It's a presence, like someone is standing just behind you, watching, waiting, existing in the same space, but just outside the limits of your senses. You turn around, nothing, but the feeling doesn't go away. In fact, it lingers, like a shadow that refuses to leave, even when the light is on. Here's the unsettling part. This isn't rare. It's not even unusual. People across cultures, ages, and backgrounds have reported this exact sensation, the eerie certainty that someone is there when absolutely no one is. Explorers stranded in frozen wastelands have felt it. Climbers on the edge of exhaustion have sworn by it. Even perfectly healthy people, sitting in perfectly normal rooms, have experienced it. So what is it? Is it your imagination glitching? A leftover instinct from a more dangerous world? Or something deeper? Something wired into the architecture of your brain? Because what if that presence isn't coming from outside at all? What if your mind is creating someone in a space that's completely empty? In 1919, during one of the most brutal expeditions in human history, the explorer, Ernest Shackleton, described something he couldn't explain. Stranded in the frozen emptiness of Antarctica, starving, exhausted, and pushed far beyond normal human limits, Shackleton and his team began to feel like they weren't alone. Not metaphorically, not poetically, literally. They each reported the same chilling sensation, an extra person walking beside them, a silent companion keeping pace, watching, present, but never visible. Years later, this phenomenon would earn a name, the third man factor, and Shackleton wasn't alone. Pilots, mountaineers, and even survivors of disasters have described the exact same experience, this persistent illusion of another human being sharing their space. But here's where it gets stranger. This isn't just something that happens in extreme environments. In the early 2000s, a neuroscientist named Olaf Blanke, at the École Polytechnique Fédérale de Lausanne, accidentally triggered this exact sensation. Inside a laboratory, his patient wasn't lost in the wilderness. She wasn't sleep-deprived or starving. She was awake, alert, and sitting in a controlled medical setting. And yet, the moment Blanke stimulated a specific region of her brain, the temporoparietal junction, she froze, because suddenly, she felt someone behind her, not imagined, not guessed, felt a presence mimicking her position, standing exactly where her body wasn't. When she leaned forward, it leaned too. When she turned, it stayed just out of sight, like a ghost perfectly synced to her movements. Blanke repeated the experiment, again and again. Different patients reported the same thing, a shadowy other occupying the space around them, sometimes comforting, sometimes terrifying, but always undeniably real. So now we have a pattern. People on the edge of survival feel it. Patients in controlled labs feel it. Even ordinary individuals, under stress or isolation, report it. Which raises a disturbing question. If the brain can manufacture the feeling of another human being, with no one actually there, then how much of your sense of reality is just your brain filling in the blanks? To understand what's really happening, you have to imagine your brain not as a passive observer, but as a prediction machine. Every second, it's trying to answer one fundamental question: where am I, and what is around me? It does this by stitching together signals: touch, movement, balance, vision into a single, seamless story of reality. And at the center of that story is you, your body, your position in space. There's one particular region quietly running this operation behind the scenes, the temporoparietal junction. It's like a conductor in an orchestra, making sure every sensory instrument is in sync. When you move your hand, your brain expects a certain feeling. When you turn your head, it predicts what your eyes should see next. When everything matches, you feel normal, grounded, alone in your own body. But when those signals start to drift out of sync, the brain panics. Because a mismatch doesn't just feel wrong, it breaks the model of self. And this is where things take a sharp, unsettling turn. In experiments led by Olaf Blanke, researchers didn't just stimulate the brain directly. They built a robotic system that could trick it. Participants would move their hands forward, while a device touched their back. Just a fraction of a second later, that tiny delay, barely noticeable, was enough to confuse the brain's internal map, and suddenly, people began to feel it. A presence, not vague, not abstract, but specifically another person standing just behind them, copying their movements with eerie precision. Some even turned around in fear, convinced someone had entered the room, but no one had. Here's the twist. The brain wasn't detecting someone else. It was misidentifying itself. That presence you feel, it's your own body map, slipping out of alignment. Your brain, unable to reconcile conflicting signals, splits the difference and creates a second you in the empty space around you. A phantom twin, close enough to feel, but impossible to see. And once you realize that, something shifts, because it means the line between self and other isn't as solid as it feels. It's fragile, adjustable, hackable, which leads to a quiet, unsettling thought. If your brain can accidentally generate the feeling of someone else being there, how certain are you that every presence you've ever felt was real? There's something deeply unsettling about realizing your brain can invent a person and make you believe they're real, not as a story, not as imagination, but as a physical, undeniable present, standing right behind you in the dark. It forces you to rethink something you've trusted your entire life, the feeling of being alone. Because maybe alone isn't just about who's physically there. Maybe it's a fragile agreement. Your brain maintains a quiet balance of signals that says, this space belongs only to you. And when that balance slips, even slightly, the mind fills the gap, not with chaos, not with randomness, but with something familiar, another human. In a strange way, that makes sense. For most of our evolutionary history, being alone was dangerous. The brain learned to stay alert, to assume presence before absence. It would rather be wrong and cautious than right and dead. So sometimes, in silence, it overcompensates. It listens too hard, predicts too much, and in doing so, it creates a shadow of companionship, an echo of another person, stitched together from your own sense of self. A ghost, made out of you. And maybe, that's the most haunting part of all. Not that your mind can trick you, but that it does. It using the very thing you trust, the most pure sense of who you are. So the next time you feel it's that subtle shift in the air, that quiet certainty that someone is there, pause for a second. Don't just look over your shoulder. Ask yourself something deeper. If your brain can create a presence out of nothing, then where exactly do you end?